Joan of Arc, a teenage girl told France she heard God. They gave her an army. There is a village in northeastern France, tucked into the rolling farmland of Lorraine, where the air still carries the weight of something unexplainable. Domremy, a name that meant nothing to the world in the early 15th century, a place of cow pastures, stone cottages, and the slow rhythm of peasant life. Bread baking, wool spinning, church bells marking the hours of a day indistinguishable from any other. And yet, from this nowhere village, a girl emerged who would alter the trajectory of European history, reshape the mythology of faith and courage, and burn, quite literally, into the permanent memory of civilization. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. She was a peasant. She was illiterate. She was a teenager. She was a military commander. She was a prisoner. She was a heretic. She was a saint. She was a political weapon, a religious icon, a feminist symbol, a nationalist myth, and, depending on whom you ask, either the most divinely inspired figure since the apostles or the most spectacularly deluded. She heard voices. She said they came from God. She told the French court she had been sent to save their kingdom, and instead of laughing her out of the room, they gave her armor, a banner, and an army. How do you understand a life like that? A life so compressed? She was active for barely more than a year before her capture, and yet so impossibly dense with meaning that 6 centuries later, historians, theologians, playwrights, filmmakers, and philosophers still argue over what she was, what she meant, and whether the forces that moved through her were divine, psychological, political, or some volatile mixture of all three. You understand it the way you understand any extraordinary life, not by zooming out into abstraction, but by zooming in, by standing in the specific moments that defined her, the visions, the battles, the trial, the fire, by walking through each one slowly, feeling the mud and the smoke and the cold stone walls of 15th century France, by listening to her own words, many of which survive because her enemies were meticulous enough to write them down. This is the story of Joan of Arc, told through the defining moments that turned an anonymous farm girl into the most legendary figure of the medieval world. And it begins, as so many impossible stories do, with a voice no one else could hear. The Voices in the Garden, 1425. When heaven spoke to a 13-year-old girl. Picture the summer of 1425. France is not really France. It is a broken, bleeding patchwork of competing loyalties, occupied territories, and exhausted populations. The 100 Years' War, which would ultimately last 116 years, because even medieval warfare had no respect for branding, has been grinding on for nearly 90 years. England controls vast swaths of northern France, including Paris. The English king, through the Treaty of Troyes, has been recognized as the heir to the French throne. The actual French heir, Charles VII, is a pale, indecisive young man holed up in the city of Chinon, too weak to be crowned, too proud to surrender, and too broke to mount a serious military campaign. France is dying, slowly, and no one seems capable of saving it. Now place yourself in a garden behind a stone farmhouse in Domremy. The light is golden. The air smells of turned earth and summer grass. A 13-year-old girl is standing near her father's property, probably alone, when something happens that she will later describe with absolute, unwavering certainty for the rest of her short life. She hears a voice. It comes, she says, from the direction of the church. It is accompanied by a great light. She is terrified at first, then overwhelmed, then deeply, permanently changed. Over the following months and years, the voice returns. It multiplies. She identifies the speakers as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, warrior saints, martyrs, heavenly figures of enormous symbolic power in the medieval Catholic imagination. And their message is staggeringly specific. They tell her she must go to the Dauphin, the uncrowned Charles VII. She must help him reclaim his kingdom. She must drive the English from France. She, a girl who cannot read, who has never held a sword, who has never traveled more than a few miles from her birthplace, must lead an army. Let me be clear about something. We will never know what actually happened in that garden. Modern scholars have proposed theories ranging from epilepsy to schizophrenia to bovine tuberculosis affecting her brain to simple, calculated political fabrication. None of these theories are fully satisfying. What we do know, what is documented beyond dispute, is that Joan believed it completely. Every interrogator who questioned her, every theologian who examined her, every soldier who fought beside her, and every judge who condemned her noted the same thing. Her conviction was total. It was granite. It did not waver under exhaustion, under threat, under the most sophisticated theological cross-examination the medieval church could devise. "I was 13 when I had a voice from God to help me govern myself," she later told her judges at Rouen. "The first time I was terrified. The voice came to me about the hour of noon in the summer in my father's garden." Whatever its source, this experience set everything else in motion. A girl who should have lived and died in obscurity, married off at 15, bearing children until her body gave out, buried in an unmarked grave like billions of medieval women before and after her, instead began preparing for a mission that everyone around her would have considered insane. And here is what makes Joan's story so electrifying even now. She didn't just believe, she acted. She started telling people. She started demanding to be taken seriously. She started doing the most dangerous thing a young woman in the 15th century could do. She started insisting that God had given her authority over men. The meeting at Chinon, February 1429. A farm girl identifies a king. By early 1429, Joan had spent nearly 4 years living with her secret, confiding in almost no one, waiting for the right moment. She was now 17. The military situation in France had deteriorated further. The English and their Burgundian allies were besieging Orléans, the last major stronghold blocking their advance into southern France. If Orléans fell, Charles VII's cause was essentially finished. The kingdom hung by a thread, and everyone knew it. Joan had already made one attempt to reach the Dauphin through a local garrison commander named Robert de Baudricourt. He had her sent home. She came back. She came back again. She made predictions. Some sources say she foretold a French military defeat near Orléans before news of it had arrived, and Baudricourt, either spooked or desperate, finally agreed to give her an escort. Imagine the journey. 11 days on horseback through enemy-controlled territory in the dead of winter. Joan had cut her hair short and dressed in men's clothing, a detail that would later be used to condemn her. She traveled with a small group of soldiers who were initially skeptical and increasingly awed. She arrived at the castle of Chinon in late February 1429, and what happened next has become one of the most famous scenes in French history. Charles, cautious and suspicious, decided to test her. According to multiple contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, he hid himself among a crowd of courtiers, dressed plainly, while another man was placed on the throne or in a position of prominence. Joan entered the Great Hall, a vast, torch-lit space packed with hundreds of nobles, clergy, and soldiers, and walked directly to the real Charles. She had never seen him before. She had no physical description to work from. She knelt before him and said, according to tradition, "Gentle Dauphin, I am Joan the Maid, sent by God to help you and your kingdom." Now, was this genuinely miraculous? Skeptics have pointed out that Charles could have been identified through subtle cues, courtiers glancing at him, his bearing, his age. It's possible someone tipped her off. But the effect on the court was electric. Here was a peasant girl, entirely out of her element, moving through a room of the most powerful people in France with the calm assurance of someone who believed she was on a divine errand. And in a culture saturated with prophecy, there was a widespread prediction at the time that France would be lost by a woman and saved by a virgin from Lorraine. Joan fit the narrative with eerie precision. Charles didn't hand her an army immediately. He had her examined by theologians at Poitiers for 3 weeks. They questioned her faith, her morals, her claims. Women physically inspected her to confirm her virginity. Her status as the maid was essential to her credibility in a culture that linked female purity with divine favor. She passed every test, not because she gave sophisticated theological answers, but because she gave answers that were disarmingly direct. When one scholar asked her what language her voices spoke, she reportedly replied, "Better than yours," a devastating put-down to a man who spoke with a regional accent. The commission at Poitiers concluded that there was nothing evil in Joan, and that, given the desperate state of the kingdom, The Dauphin had nothing to lose by employing her. It was not a ringing divine endorsement. It was something more pragmatic and more human, a calculated bet made by a failing government. But it was enough. Joan was given armor, a household, and a place in the army marching to relieve Orléans. She was 17 years old. The Siege of Orléans, May 14, 29, the battle that changed everything. Orléans, in the spring of 1429, was a city holding its breath. The English had surrounded it with a network of fortified positions, bastilles they were called, choking off supplies and slowly starving the population. French relief forces had been sent and repulsed. Morale was catastrophic. The people of Orléans were beginning to negotiate terms of surrender. And then Joan arrived. She entered the city on April 29th, riding through the Burgundy Gate in full armor, carrying a white banner painted with an image of Christ holding the world, flanked by two angels, with the words Jesus Maria emblazoned across it. The crowds were enormous. Torches blazed. People wept. They surged forward to touch her horse, to touch her banner. A contemporary account notes that someone's torch accidentally set her banner on fire, and Joan calmly spurred her horse forward, leaned down, and extinguished the flames herself. A small moment that the crowd took as further proof of her extraordinary composure. But Joan had not come to be a mascot. She had come to fight. And this is where her story becomes genuinely baffling to military historians. Joan had no training. She had no battlefield experience. She could barely ride a horse when she first set out from Domremy. She had learned on the journey to Chinon. She was functionally illiterate and could not read maps or correspondence. By every rational metric, she should have been a liability on the battlefield. She was not. Over the course of approximately 1 week in early May, Joan participated in a series of assaults on the English fortifications surrounding Orléans. She didn't devise complex tactical plans. The experienced captains around her, men like Jean de Dunois and La Hire, handled the operational details. But what Joan provided was something that no amount of tactical skill could replace. She provided will. She provided the absolute, unshakable conviction that God had ordained French victory, and she radiated that conviction with such intensity that it became contagious. During the assault on the fortified position of Les Tourelles on May 7th, Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt that pierced her shoulder above her breastplate. She was carried from the field, weeping in pain. She pulled the bolt out herself, or, by some accounts, had a soldier pull it while she held still. She prayed. She bound the wound with olive oil and lard, a common battlefield treatment. And then she went back. Let that sit for a moment. A 17-year-old girl, fighting in her first real battle, takes an arrow through the shoulder, and she goes back to the front line. The French soldiers, who had been on the verge of retreating, saw her banner rise again above the chaos and surged forward with renewed ferocity. Les Tourelles fell. The next morning, the English abandoned their remaining positions and withdrew. Orléans was free. The siege had lasted 7 months. Joan broke it in 9 days. The news spread across France like wildfire. The girl from Domremy, the maid, had done what seasoned commanders could not. The psychological impact was immeasurable. English morale crumbled. French resistance stiffened everywhere. And Joan, now the most famous person in France, turned her attention to the next phase of what she believed was her divine mission. The coronation at Rheims, July 17, 1429. Crowning a king, completing a mission. Joan had always been specific about her goals. Break the siege of Orléans, crown the Dauphin at Rheims. These were the 2 tasks her voices had given her, and she pursued them with a single-mindedness that sometimes put her at odds with Charles's more cautious advisors. Rheims was deep in English-controlled territory. Marching an army there meant passing through hostile lands, taking fortified cities along the way, and exposing the Dauphin himself to enormous risk. Charles's counselors urged a safer strategy. Consolidate gains, negotiate with Burgundy, move slowly. Joan wanted to move immediately. She won the argument, partly through the force of her personality, partly because her recent victory had given her political capital that no one else in the kingdom possessed. The March to Rheims in June and July of 1429 was one of the most remarkable military campaigns of the medieval period. City after city opened its gates, some after brief skirmishes, others without a fight. The mere approach of Joan's army, preceded by her now legendary reputation, was enough to dissolve resistance. At Troyes, the city that had given its name to the treaty disinheriting Charles, the garrison surrendered after Joan personally led an assault demonstration that terrified the defenders into negotiations. On July 17, 1429, in the great cathedral of Reims, the traditional coronation site of French kings since the time of Clovis, Charles VII was anointed and crowned. The sacred oil, the ancient ritual, the soaring Gothic arches, the chanting clergy, the packed congregation of nobles, soldiers, and common people who had flooded the city. It was a spectacle of enormous political and spiritual significance. By being crowned at Reims with the traditional rites, Charles was no longer a pretender. He was, in the eyes of God and his people, the legitimate king of France. Joan stood near the altar throughout the ceremony, holding her banner. When asked later why her banner was given such a prominent place, she replied with characteristic directness. It had shared in the hardships. It was only right that it share in the honor. This was the peak. This was the summit of Joan's earthly mission as she understood it. She had accomplished what her voices had commanded. Some historians believe she wanted to stop here, to go home. There are indications in the trial records that Joan herself felt her mission was essentially complete after the coronation. But the war continued, and Joan was now too valuable, too politically useful, too symbolically powerful to be allowed to retire to Domremy. And this is the cruel pivot of her story. The very forces that elevated her were about to destroy her. Because kings, once crowned, often find that the instruments of their crowning become inconvenient. A living saint is an unpredictable asset. A girl who claims to speak for God is only useful as long as she tells you what you want to hear. The Trial and the Fire, January to May 1431. The Murder of a Saint. Joan was captured on May 23, 1430, during a skirmish outside Compiègne. She was pulled from her horse by a Burgundian soldier. Charles VII, the king she had crowned, did nothing to ransom her. Nothing. The silence from the French court was deafening and damning. Joan was sold to the English for 10,000 livres, a king's ransom, ironically enough, and handed over to the ecclesiastical court at Rouen, where she would face trial for heresy. The trial of Joan of Arc is one of the most thoroughly documented legal proceedings of the entire medieval period, and reading the transcripts today is a harrowing experience. The chief judge was Pierre Cochon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a pro-English clergyman with transparent political motives. He assembled a panel of dozens of theologians, canon lawyers, and clerics. Their goal was not to discover the truth. Their goal was to convict her. The English needed Joan discredited, not just defeated, but proven to be a fraud, a witch, a heretic, an instrument of the devil. Because if Joan was genuine, then God was on France's side, and the entire English claim to the French throne was a rebellion against divine will. The trial lasted from January to May of 1431. Joan was interrogated repeatedly, often for hours, without legal counsel, in sessions deliberately designed to confuse and entrap her. The questions were fiendishly clever. "Do you know whether you are in God's grace?" was one of the most famous. It was a trap. If she said yes, she was guilty of presumption, since no mortal could claim certain knowledge of God's grace. If she said no, she was confessing to sin. Joan's answer stunned the courtroom. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The notaries recording the trial wrote that several judges were visibly shaken by this response. It was, by any theological standard, a perfect answer, humble, faithful, and doctrinally sound, from an illiterate teenager. But the outcome was predetermined. The court found Joan guilty on multiple charges, chief among them the wearing of men's clothing, a charge so transparently absurd, so clearly a pretext, that it reveals the entire trial for what it was, a political assassination dressed in ecclesiastical robes. Joan briefly recanted under threat of immediate execution, then retracted her recantation when she realized she had been tricked. She had been told she would be transferred to a church prison with female guards, but was instead returned to her English military prison, where male guards reportedly attempted to assault her, forcing her to resume wearing men's clothing for protection. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. Accounts of her execution are consistent and devastating. She asked for a cross. An English soldier fashioned a small one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She held it as the flames rose. She called out to her saints. She called out the name of Jesus repeatedly. The executioner later reported that her heart would not burn, that it remained intact in the ashes, a detail that may be legend, but that was widely believed and widely reported. An English soldier who had come to watch is said to have staggered away from the burning, white-faced, and gasped, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." He was right on both counts. England would lose the war, and Joan would, in time, be declared exactly what that soldier feared she was. Threads that run through it all. When you step back from the smoke and the noise and look at Joan's story whole, certain threads emerge, patterns that connect every chapter, every moment, every impossible turn. The first is conviction without compromise. From the garden in Domremy to the stake in Rouen, Joan never hedged. She never softened her claims, never offered a comfortable ambiguity that might have saved her life. Her voices were real to her. Her mission was real. She held to that with a consistency that either reflects genuine divine contact or the most extraordinary psychological commitment in recorded history. The second is the power of narrative. Joan understood, instinctively, not intellectually, that wars are won in the mind before they are won on the field. Her white banner, her armor, her virginity, her youth, her prophetic claims, these were not incidental. They were the story. France needed a miracle, and Joan gave them one, regardless of whether the miracle was supernatural or simply human. The third is the expendability of instruments. Charles VII used Joan and discarded her. The church that should have protected a faithful daughter convicted her instead. The political systems she served consumed her the moment she became inconvenient. This pattern, the hero elevated and then sacrificed, recurs throughout history with sickening regularity, and Joan's case remains one of its most vivid examples. The fourth is gender as battlefield. Joan's trial was, at its core, about a woman who had transgressed the boundaries of acceptable female behavior. She wore men's clothing. She commanded men. She claimed direct access to God without male ecclesiastical mediation. Every charge against her was ultimately a charge against her refusal to be what a medieval woman was supposed to be: silent, obedient, and invisible. The fifth is the persistence of mystery. After 600 years of scholarship, we still do not know what Joan experienced in that garden. We cannot explain her military effectiveness. We cannot fully account for her composure under interrogation. Something happened in Domremy in 1425, and whatever it was, it produced a human being of such extraordinary force that the most powerful institutions of the medieval world, the English crown, the Burgundian state, the Catholic Church, had to collaborate to destroy her. And even then, they failed. Because you cannot burn a story, you can only spread it. The fire that still burns. In 1456, 25 years after her execution, a papal court reviewed Joan's trial and declared it fraudulent. She was officially rehabilitated, declared innocent of all charges. In 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. The same institution that burned her eventually venerated her. History has a sense of irony that borders on cruelty, but Joan's legacy extends far beyond the church that alternately condemned and canonized her. She became a symbol of French national identity, invoked by monarchists and Republicans alike, by resistance fighters in World War II, and by politicians across the entire ideological spectrum. She has been claimed by feminists and by traditionalists, by the devout and by the secular, by those who see in her the hand of God, and by those who see in her the magnificent, terrifying power of human belief in the absence of any God at all. What does she mean, finally? What is the message that survives the fire? Perhaps it is this, that the distance between the impossible and the actual is shorter than we think, and that the bridge between them is almost always a single person who refuses to accept the world as it is. Joan did not have training. She did not have education, wealth, connections, or any of the things that her world insisted were necessary for significance. What she had was a voice, whether divine or internal, and the will to obey it completely. We opened this story with a question. How do you understand a life like this? A life so brief and so immense, so grounded in the mud of 15th century France, and so untethered from everything we consider normal? The answer, I think, is that you don't fully understand it, and that's the point. Joan of Arc resists easy explanation, the way fire resists being held. She is too hot, too bright, too dangerous for any single interpretation to contain her. She was a peasant girl who changed the fate of nations. She was a teenager who faced down the most powerful men in Europe and did not blink. She was a prisoner who chose death over the betrayal of her own truth. And she was 19 years old, younger than most of the people watching this, standing in a marketplace in Rouen, holding a makeshift cross fashioned from 2 sticks, calling out the name of Jesus as the smoke rose around her, absolutely certain in that final, terrible, luminous moment that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 6 centuries later, the fire has long gone out in Rouen, but the light from it hasn't dimmed at all. If anything, it burns brighter with each generation that discovers her, each voice that tells her story, each person who hears about a teenage girl from nowhere who was told her dreams were impossible and who went ahead and changed the world anyway. That is Joan of Arc. That is the Maid of Orleans. And if her story does nothing else, let it remind you of this. The voices that matter most are often the ones that no one else can hear. The question is whether you have the courage to listen.